Let me now take a slight step back and compare and contrast two main types of institutional realities that you would find in any context. And those are formal institutional structures and informal institutional structures. To give you a clear and concise appreciation of formal versus informal institutions, I want to take a few minutes to make you aware of a very relevant publication in this context. The publication in question is titled Informal Institutions and Comparative Politics, a Research Agenda, and it was published in the magazine Perspectives on Politics in 2004. The authors of this publication conceptualize formal institutions as, quote, openly codified in the sense that they are established and communicated through channels that are widely accepted as official, end quote. Simply put, most people are instinctively aware of formal institutions and, more importantly, are expected to avail themselves of these institutions in order to get things done. Informal institutions, on the other hand, are described as, quote, socially shared rules, usually unwritten, that are created, communicated, and enforced outside of officially sanctioned channels, end quote. In other words, such institutions are at times substituting for the more formal institutions, and people resort to informal channels to avoid what they might perceive as inefficiencies or delays in the more formal arrangements. This substitution dynamic is indeed more readily observed in emerging and frontier markets compared to more developed economies. If the formal institutions are captured by political elites, people on the margins of society may find it much more difficult to work through those institutions, provided they're not even shut out from them in the first place. Informal arrangements then become an inevitable fallback position. It is also worth keeping in mind that formal institutions, to the extent that they exist in the first place in emerging and frontier markets, sometimes are remnants of colonialism. Moreover, institutions, or if you want to use another term, you can use the term bureaucracies, are not necessarily inherently organic. In other words, once created, they prove extremely difficult and slow to change. And if such institutions or bureaucracies are indeed remnants of a country's colonial past, it is entirely possible that their very structures may prove wholly inappropriate to the contemporary context, or at the minimum, make the process of working through them exceedingly time-consuming and, yes, inefficient at times. Additionally, as I had previously alluded to with the North Korea example in the previous video, attempts to change institutional arrangements, however inefficient they may be, are met with resistance by those vested interests in society who are still benefiting from the status quo, regardless of the burdens that those institutions may impose on the broader public. Another way to conceptualize this problem, or this tendency to resist bureaucratic institutional change, is to consider Max Weber's maxim, or observation rather, that any bureaucracy once created will prove very difficult to dismantle, and instead it will invariably create additional justifications for its continued existence. In the previously mentioned study titled Informal Institutions and Comparative Politics, a Research Agenda, the authors present a rather insightful typology, as you can see in this table. And from the perspective of emerging and frontier markets, we are especially interested in informal institutions that emerge against the backdrop of inefficient and ineffective formal institutions. But for the sake of overall clarity, I will briefly walk you through all four categories that are presented here. So let us first consider the scenario of effective formal institutions. In this context, we can differentiate between two types of informal institutions. On the one hand, we may see the emergence of so-called complementary informal institutions. As the label itself already suggests, such institutions do not rival the formal institutions, but rather coexist alongside them. In the words of the authors, these complementary institutions, quote, fill in gaps, either by addressing contingencies not dealt with in the formal rules or by facilitating the pursuit of individual goals within the formal institutional framework. Complementary informal institutions may also serve as a foundation for formal institutions, creating or strengthening incentives to comply with formal rules that might otherwise exist merely on paper, end quote. Next, we have the so-called accommodating informal institutions, which appear to, quote, create incentives to behave in ways that alter the substantive effects of formal rules, but without directly violating them. They contradict the spirit, but not the letter of the formal rules. Accommodating informal institutions are often created by actors who dislike outcomes generated by the formal rules, but are unable to change or openly violate those rules, end quote. And as previously mentioned, from the perspective of emerging and frontier markets, the more relevant and important consideration is that of ineffective formal institutions. And this reality could derive from the simple fact that the formal institutions may be staffed and or led by incompetent and unqualified individuals, and even those institutions might have become breeding grounds for nepotism. Alternatively, these formal institutions may be burdened with debilitating levels of corruption and or lack the necessary levels of transparency and accountability. As a result, ineffective informal institutions will then give rise to so-called substitutive or competing informal institutions. Now, competing informal institutions, according to the authors, tend to, quote, structure incentives in ways that are incompatible with the formal rules. To follow one rule, actors must violate another. And those institutions are also often found in post-colonial contexts in which formal institutions were imposed on indigenous rules and authority structures, end quote. And finally, we have the substitutive informal institutions category. Those institutions are similar to complementary institutions in the sense that they, quote, are employed by actors who seek outcomes compatible with formal rules and procedures. Like the aforementioned competing informal institutions, however, they exist in environments where formal rules are not routinely enforced. Simply put then, substitutive informal institutions aim to achieve what the formal ones were designed for, but ultimately fail to achieve. This scenario tends to usually be the case in countries that exhibit generally weak state structures and or a lack of overall authority. So overall, in many emerging and frontier markets, the creative embrace of informal institutions, or what the scholarly literature at times describes as institutional entrepreneurship, is indeed very much needed to address and fix deep-seated problems and overcome various hurdles, whether they be of a political, regulatory, or legal nature. In a broad sense, then, the emergence of informal institutions can be the result of incompleteness of formal institutions. And in the context of rapid economic growth, such incompleteness might be seen as an unnecessary drag on future growth, which then may simply accelerate the fallback on informal institutional arrangements. A second reason for for the emergence of informal institutional structures might be a widespread disappointment over the inability to achieve formal institutional solutions. In the words of the author of the publication I had previously quoted, informal institutions may be a second-best strategy for actors who prefer but cannot achieve a formal institutional solution. In some cases, the actors simply lack the power to change the formal rules. End quote. If institutional structures need to change in emerging and frontier markets to see their economic engines come to life, an obvious question is whether or not the country has the luxury to wait until the necessary institutional changes are made, which could very well take years, and thus effectively delay economic growth and development and potentially feed into broader societal discontent in the near to medium term. Or the alternative question would be whether a more proactive approach, even if it bypasses formal institutional structures, might be justified or in fact needed. And finally, the third overarching reason for the creation of informal institutions might well be the pursuit of goals that are not always necessarily publicly acceptable. So on the whole, informal institutions tend to be somewhat more inconspicuous, meaning that they tend to fly under the radar as much as possible and operate behind the scenes. Situations of institutional uncertainty, which is largely fueled by institutional effectiveness and inefficiency of formal institutions, thus provides an opening for what I had previously called institutional entrepreneurship, through which you aim to address challenges, bridge development gaps, or even compensate for institutional inefficiencies. Tarun Khanna illustrates this notion of institutional entrepreneurship by studying, for example, the healthcare gaps that exist in emerging and frontier markets. In one instance, he provided the illustrative example of the Narayana Hospital in India, which is the brainchild of the world-renowned Indian surgeon Devi Shetty. Dr. Shetty began to recognize that people who most desperately need life-saving or preventive surgery do not always get these procedures because of various institutional voids. Either they do not have access to relevant hospitals where they live, or they may not have the means to travel to the hospital. These and other challenges, in turn, present opportunities for entrepreneurs to fill a particular void. On the whole, institutional entrepreneurship can manifest itself in three fundamental ways, as was outlined in a 2011 publication by Paul Tracy and Nelson Phillips titled Entrepreneurship in Emerging Markets: Strategies for New Venture Creation in Uncertain Institutional Contexts. According to the authors, you could engage in what they call institutional brokering, and which they define, which occurs when entrepreneurs, quote, found ventures that reduce the institutional uncertainty faced by other actors in a particular organizational field. In doing so, entrepreneurs create value by moderating the risk of economic transactions, end quote. Entrepreneurs intending to span the institutional voids, meanwhile, aim to have, quote, their approach to solving a given institutional problem to become the standard, taken for granted solution. And finally, the strategy of bridging the institutional distance is conceptualized as, quote, the practice of translating or transposing an institution between countries characterized by significant institutional differences in order to create new ventures in an emerging market. Most obviously, this involves transferring institutions from a developed economy in order to exploit an emerging market, end quote. In wrapping up this portion of the Week 3 lecture, and notwithstanding the obvious challenges for emerging and frontier markets, glaring institutional voids, oftentimes, as we had already mentioned, do give rise to some of the most ingenious solutions. A very interesting case study in this context is the Harvard Business School case study about Pharmacia Similares. And this is not a case study that I assigned for this class. But the case study describes the entrepreneurial idea of Victor Gonzalez Torres, also more affectionately known as Dr. Simi, to address the healthcare needs of Mexico's low-income sector. The Pharmacia Similares business model was centered around providing low-cost access on the order of about $2 per visit for over 2 million people a month. Now, the 2 million people was reached by the time the business model had been sufficiently scaled. But you provided low-cost access to a large number of people by giving them essentially access to doctors and clinics that was set up adjacent to each one of the Pharmacia Similares outlets. And this case study is yet another compelling example of how challenges in emerging and frontier markets can give rise to truly innovative solutions.